each of the 16 compartments is watertight. Even if 4 compartments flood, she'll stay afloat.
From the very day that she was designed, she was almost doomed. So this is almost the Achilles heel of the Titanic.
The Titanic's last voice wasn't a scream from her decks, but a stream of desperate dots and dashes tapped out into the night.
There's no doubt that the ship struck an iceberg. What everyone wants to know is how this seemingly unsinkable ship could suddenly sink.
Recently, experts pieced together the ship's final wireless transmissions, messages that reveal not just panic, but professionalism, bravery, and even a mysterious death scream before silence forever fell. What they uncovered left historians speechless. Tonight, we decode Titanic's last SOS, word for word, and uncover the human drama behind the world's most haunting telegraphs. The world of wires, Titanic's radio room. The Titanic's passengers thought the radio was a luxury. They sent messages across the Atlantic bragging about the voyage, telling friends about poker games, even declaring, "Fine voyage, fine ship," without knowing those words would echo as bitter irony. But within hours, the same machine that carried trivial chatter became the only thing standing between life and death for more than 2,000 people. From the wireless room, Titanic spoke its last words to the world, words that experts would later decode and describe as chilling beyond imagination. What exactly did those final signals say? Why did one faint burst of static become known as the Titanic's death scream? And why did these messages, over a century later, still leave even hardened researchers speechless? To understand the weight of those last transmissions, we have to step into the cramped radio room, the beating heart of Titanic's communications. This was the Marconi room, named after Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian inventor who had brought wireless telegraphy to the oceans. At the time, it was cutting-edge technology. Most ships still relied on lookouts and signals by flags or lamps. But Titanic carried one of the most powerful radio sets ever installed at sea. Its call sign was MGY, a short identifier that every ship would recognize. With a range of about 350 miles, and sometimes more under the right conditions, Titanic's wireless could reach across the Atlantic to Cape Race in Newfoundland, where messages could then be sent on to New York. For wealthy passengers, this was a marvel. They could sit in their cabin and send telegrams home in the middle of the ocean, as casually as if they were writing a postcard. For the ship itself, the radio was more than luxury. It was the only lifeline in an emergency. Inside the wireless room, 2 men carried the burden of keeping Titanic connected. Jack Phillips was the senior operator, just 25 years old. He had been trained by the Marconi Company and was already experienced in the grueling life of an operator at sea. His work on Titanic was relentless. He often labored for more than 12 hours a day, clearing a backlog of passenger messages after the wireless set had broken down earlier in the voyage. Imagine sitting at a desk in a small, hot cabin, headphones clamped over your ears, deciphering endless streams of Morse code, tapping back quick replies with precision. Fatigue was constant, and so was irritation. Phillips had a reputation for professionalism, but also a quick temper. On the night of the disaster, he had snapped at Cyril Evans, the lone operator on the nearby Californian, who tried to relay yet another iceberg warning. Phillips, overwhelmed by passenger traffic, cut him off sharply with the words, "Shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." That single outburst may have sealed Titanic's fate, since Evans, humiliated, turned off his set and went to bed, leaving his ship, the closest to Titanic, deaf to her final cries. Alongside Phillips sat Harold Bride, the junior operator, only 22 years old. Bride was quiet, diligent, and new to the life of long shifts and heavy responsibility. He had something rare among wireless operators: a close personal friendship with Harold Cottam, the operator on the Cunard liner Carpathia. It was Cottam who would become the first to hear Titanic's distress call and push his captain to turn the Carpathia around, steaming through the night to reach the survivors. Bride's connection to Cottam adds a layer of tragedy and fate to the story. In the middle of the Atlantic, two friends were unknowingly linked by the most desperate messages ever sent, one transmitting as his ship died, the other straining to answer and save whoever he could. Bride himself would survive by clinging to an overturned lifeboat in the freezing ocean, later reunited with Cottam aboard Carpathia, where, despite his injuries and exhaustion, he helped send survivor messages to families waiting ashore. Life in the radio room before the disaster was a strange mix of monotony, camaraderie, and technology. Wireless operators across ships spoke in a slang that sounded almost like schoolboy banter. They called each other "old man" in their Morse messages, a kind of easy nickname. Long nights were spent tapping out personal telegrams for passengers. "Dining with you in spirit, heart with you always," read one. Another reported bluntly, "No sickness, all well. Notify all interested in poker." They were light, ordinary words, human chatter stretched across the sea. But when read today, those same messages feel ghostly, casual voices floating just hours before catastrophe. The operators, still young men themselves, were the gatekeepers of all this communication, connecting Titanic to the outside world. The wireless was more than wires and sparks. It was a symbol of modernity, a promise that nothing could isolate a ship anymore. Yet, in practice, it was fragile. It could only send or receive one message at a time. The system relied on operators working constantly, often without sleep. It was vulnerable to fatigue, interference, and even arrogance, as with Phillips's dismissal of the Californian. In those conditions, luxury turned into fragility. What began as a novelty service for first-class passengers suddenly had to shoulder the unbearable weight of life and death distress calls. The same instrument that once sent "Fine voyage, fine ship" would end with "Come quick, engine room nearly full." And in between those two signals lies the entire tragic arc of Titanic's final night. Titanic speaks, the final hours of Morse. The decoding of Titanic's final SOS, sent in the very last minutes before the ship disappeared beneath the Atlantic, has been described by researchers as nothing less than groundbreaking. For decades, the timeline of her wireless messages was thought to end around 2:17 a.m. When her power failed, the lights flickered out and the wireless set fell silent. But experts analyzing garbled bursts of Morse, preserved in logs from ships straining to listen that night, now believe Titanic's last transmission came even closer to 2:20 a.m. The precise moment she broke apart and sank. What those final dots and dashes contained has left many speechless, not only because of their content, but because they represent the very last audible trace of Titanic's voice. Can you imagine hearing a ship, moments from vanishing forever, still trying to speak? And could that faint, broken signal, remembered as the death scream, have been more than just static? The story begins at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, when Titanic collided with the iceberg that sealed her fate. The impact tore open her hull on the starboard side, breaching compartments that were supposed to keep her afloat. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith and his officers scrambled to understand the damage. But below deck, water was already pouring in. It took less than half an hour before the wireless room was turned from a place of passenger chatter into a command post for survival. At 12:15 a.m., senior wireless operator Jack Phillips, assisted by junior operator Harold Bride, tapped out the first official distress call. It read simply, CQD-MGY, position 41.46N, 50.14W. CQD was the Marconi Company's distress signal, an abbreviation known to operators everywhere. It was the first time Titanic openly admitted to the world that she was in mortal danger. The first ship to respond was the German liner Frankfurt, some 250 kilometers away. Its operator asked Titanic what was wrong, and Phillips replied with cold precision, "We have struck an iceberg and sinking by the head." Almost immediately, other ships began relaying the call. The Mount Temple passed the word along, broadcasting to all stations within reach. "Attention all stations. Titanic is sending CQD, asking for help." On shore, the Cape Race station in Newfoundland caught the signals, forwarding them to New York. Within minutes, Titanic's plight was no longer her secret. The Atlantic airwaves carried it to anyone listening. At 12:25 a.m., Titanic's signal reached the Cunard liner Carpathia, about 58 miles away. Its operator, Harold Cottam, had been idly listening before bed, headphones still on. At first, he thought it might be a mistake. "Do you know you are sending a distress call to Cape Race?" But Phillips's reply left no doubt. Titanic was sinking. Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, ordered his ship turned around at full speed, pushing engines to their limits. The Carpathia could not arrive for 4 hours, but her wireless messages reassured Titanic, "Coming hard as we can, old man. All our boats ready." That small phrase, "old man," was wireless slang, a gesture of solidarity between operators who knew they might never speak again. As the minutes ticked past midnight, Titanic's wireless sparked with a growing urgency. Phillips sent messages to any ship within reach: Baltic, Olympic, Virginian, Burma. Some were hundreds of miles away, too distant to help in time, but they all began steaming toward Titanic's coordinates. Others, like the Californian, were much closer but tragically deaf, because their sole operator had switched off his set after Phillips's earlier rebuke. Between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m., the wireless room became the stage of Titanic's unfolding tragedy. Phillips sent words that carried the weight of 2,000 souls. "Women and children in boats. Cannot last much longer." Then, "Come at once. We are sinking fast." Another followed. "Engine room flooded." These were not just signals. They were the ship's heartbeat. Each transmission a reminder that the clock was running out. But the airwaves were crowded. Other ships, desperate to confirm details, clogged the channel with questions. Phillips, exhausted and furious, snapped at Frankfurt's operator, who kept asking for clarification. "You fool! Keep out, and stand by." It was the cry of a man who knew every second wasted meant with more lives lost. At 12:45 a.m., Titanic introduced a new code. Until then, CQD had been the standard distress call, but Bride, perhaps to break the tension, made a grim joke. "Send SOS," he told Phillips. "It's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it." Phillips obliged, tapping out the now universal SOS signal. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. It was both routine and chilling, the first time SOS had been used in a disaster of this scale. From that moment on, Titanic alternated between CQD and SOS, filling the air with both, as if layering one plea on top of another might bring help faster. By 1:30 a.m., the mood of the transmissions had changed. Earlier messages had been urgent, but measured. Now they carried desperation. "We are putting the women off in boats," Phillips sent. "Cannot last much longer." Another read, "Come quick, engine room nearly full." Carpathia, straining at maximum speed, sent reassurance after reassurance, "Coming as fast as we can." Other ships added promises, but the math was impossible. None could arrive in time. The climax came between 1:30 and 2:10 a.m., as Titanic fought to stay afloat. On deck, lifeboats were lowering, flares were firing into the night, and the list of the ship was growing. In the wireless room, Phillips kept tapping, fingers stiff, as Bride stood beside him, relaying positions and answering replies. Reports suggest the operators continued sending both CQD and SOS, alternating rhythmically, even as the floor beneath them tilted and the cold crept in. Carpathia's operator, listening intently, later recalled Titanic's words as haunting. "Women and children in boats cannot last much longer." At 1:45 a.m., Titanic still had power, but the signals were weakening. By 2:00 a.m., water was rising toward the wireless room itself. Phillips kept sending until the last possible minute. At around 2:10 a.m., Bride forced him into a life jacket, telling him it was no use to die at the quay. Together, they tried to flee, but Phillips returned once more to his post, unable to abandon it. Survivor accounts later confirmed that the Marconi room was fully abandoned only when water began flooding in. And then came the final moment. Around 2:17 a.m., Titanic's signals abruptly ceased. Virginian's operator reported hearing a faint, garbled burst around that time, not a coherent message, but something like static exploding into the headphones. Some believe it was Phillips's last attempt to send SOS as the set shorted out. Others argue it was the sound of Titanic's electrical systems collapsing as water swallowed the dynamos, a physical death scream of the ship itself. Experts who studied the logs decades later concluded that what was captured may not have been human at all, but the electromagnetic chaos of a giant ship tearing itself apart. Whatever it was, it marked the exact moment when Titanic's voice fell silent. By 2:20 a.m., Titanic was gone, her bow plunging beneath the surface, her stern rising high before breaking apart. 3 minutes after the last signal, the ocean closed over her. The silence that followed was deafening on the airwaves. Yet other ships, unaware she had already disappeared, continued to call her name. At 2:35 a.m., Carpathia signaled, "If you are there, we are firing rockets." At 2:58 a.m., Burma called into the void, "Hope you are safe." These unanswered calls, thrown into darkness, still read like epitaphs written in Morse code. The decoding of that final broken signal at 2:17 has given historians a precise timestamp of Titanic's last breath on the air. It is both a scientific and emotional discovery. Scientifically, it shows the limits of early wireless and how interference, power failure, and even catastrophic destruction could produce ghostly bursts mistaken for words. Emotionally, it captures the horror of a ship still trying to speak as it died, her operators refusing to stop until the water forced their hands. That faint noise was not just static. It was the sound of Titanic herself, drowning. The sound of silence. The calls. After 2:20. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's voice vanished forever. But even as she lay shattered on the seabed 2 miles below, other ships across the North Atlantic still believed her to be afloat. To them, Titanic was not gone, but merely waiting, her operators perhaps busy or her equipment faint. These transmissions, recorded faithfully in ship logs, are among the most haunting remnants of that night. because they reveal not the voice of Titanic herself, but the voices of others trying desperately to find her. At 2:35 a.m., the Carpathia called out into the void. "If you are there, we are firing rockets." The operator, Harold Cottam, had no idea the great liner was already lying broken beneath the waves. 23 minutes later, at 2:58 a.m., the Burma tried again. "Hope you are safe." It is hard to imagine words more devastating in retrospect, because by that point, more than 1,500 people were dead or dying in the freezing Atlantic. The unanswered messages continued as the night wore on. Titanic's call sign, MGY, was tapped again and again, as though repetition could summon a response. But MGY would never answer again. The very letters, once symbols of luxury and speed, became ghostly echoes. What does it mean when ships call into the dark, fully believing their signals are reaching human ears, when in reality they are speaking to the silence of the deep? That question is what gives these after-midnight transmissions their extraordinary emotional weight. It is one thing to hear Titanic cry out for help, but it is something altogether different to hear others calling her back, unaware they were speaking to a grave. By the time those messages were sent, Titanic's wireless operators were no longer at their posts. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, had remained at his key until seawater reached the Marconi room itself. He was 25 years old, exhausted after nearly a week of near-constant work, and yet he refused to stop tapping out signals until Bride physically pulled him away. Harold Bride later told investigators that he would never forget Phillips's work in the last 15 minutes. The steady rhythm of distress, even as the ship listed and the deck grew chaotic. "I will never forget his work during the last awful 15 minutes," Bride said, his words capturing both admiration and grief. Phillips did not survive that night. Accounts suggest he may have made it onto an overturned collapsible boat, but if so, he either fell off or succumbed to exposure before dawn. His body was never recovered. Bride, only 22 at the time, survived, though just barely. After forcing Phillips into a life jacket and trying to get him to leave the wireless room, Bride himself was swept into the freezing sea. He managed to cling to the same overturned collapsible lifeboat that carried dozens of men through the night. Among them, the ship's designer Thomas Andrews and second officer Charles Lightoller. Bride's feet were badly crushed, and he was half frozen, but he managed to stay alive until Carpathia arrived. His ordeal was far from over, however, because fate had one final, cruel irony in store. The wireless operator on Carpathia was Harold Cottam, Bride's personal friend. The two had exchanged countless light-hearted messages before Titanic's voyage, joking across the airwaves. Now they met again, not in a wireless room but on a deck crowded with traumatized survivors. Despite his injuries, Bride did not collapse. Instead, he joined Cottam in the Carpathia's wireless cabin and began assisting him in sending out the avalanche of messages that poured in from survivors desperate to reach their families. For days, Carpathia's Marconi set was alive with signals. Survivors informing relatives that they were alive, reporters demanding news, government agencies coordinating responses. Bride, who had lost his ship, his colleague, and nearly his life, sat down at the key and began tapping again. The very same hand that had carried Titanic's final pleas now carried words of life and reassurance. It is impossible not to see the human resilience in that moment. A man rising from near death to help others speak to the world again. The contrast between the human stories and the mechanical efficiency of Morse code could not be sharper. To a listener, those dots and dashes might have seemed detached, precise, stripped of emotion. But behind every signal was a man with headphones pressed against his ears, surrounded by panic, cold, and exhaustion. Phillips, hammering out CQD and SOS until the sea reached his feet, was not a machine, but a young man aware of his own impending death. Bride, making sardonic jokes about sending SOS, was masking his fear with the only humor he could summon, and Cottam, faithfully answering messages from Titanic until her voice went silent, must have realized with growing horror that his friend was on the other end of those fading signals. Why do these unanswered signals still hold such power over us more than a century later? Perhaps because they remind us that death is not always loud. Titanic's final scream may have been a burst of static at 2:17 a.m., but the true tragedy lies in what followed: minutes, then hours of silence, punctuated only by futile attempts to speak to the dead. It is a scenario that chills us because it is so universal. We all know what it is to call out and receive no reply. We all know what it means to speak into silence. When Carpathia's rockets lit up the horizon hours later, the survivors on lifeboats knew they were saved. But those still listening across the Atlantic did not yet know that Titanic herself was lost. It took hours, even days, for the reality to become clear. In those early hours, there was only speculation, fragments of rumor, and the lingering hope that a ship as mighty as Titanic could not truly be gone. The wireless world had never faced such a catastrophe before. There had been collisions, groundings, and rescues, but never had a vessel this large, with so many lives, sent out its death throes live on the airwaves. That is why these details are so essential to understanding Titanic's final hours. The wireless did not just carry distress, it carried humanity. It carried loss, courage, silence, and survival. And it carried them in dots and dashes that still echo more than 100 years later, from tragedy to law. In April 1912, the world was confronted not only with the spectacle of the greatest ship ever built, lying broken at the bottom of the Atlantic, but also with the realization that the very system meant to save lives, the wireless, had failed when it was needed most. The tragedy revealed flaws not in the technology itself, but in the rules governing its use. The most obvious failure was that not every ship kept its wireless operating around the clock. When Titanic sent out her earliest calls, the Californian, the very ship nearest to her, had its wireless switched off. Its sole operator had gone to bed, because there was no requirement to maintain a 24-hour watch. That single gap meant that a vessel less than 20 miles away sat in darkness, while others hundreds of miles distant strained to hear Titanic's cries. In the aftermath, the world could not ignore the fact that silence on the wireless could be as deadly as the iceberg itself. The first immediate reform was therefore simple but revolutionary. Ships were required to maintain continuous wireless watches, day and night, without interruption. Coastal stations, too, were ordered to listen around the clock. This rule alone transformed the sea into a far more connected place, ensuring that no distress call would again vanish into empty air because a wireless room was closed. It also changed the lives of operators, who went from being seen as optional technicians for passenger telegrams to being indispensable guardians of safety. The endless hum of wireless traffic that became normal after 1912 can be traced directly to those silent minutes when Titanic was calling for help, and no one close enough could hear. Another reform came in the very words used to summon rescue. Before Titanic, ships used CQD as the conventional distress call, though it was not universally understood and sometimes mistaken for less urgent traffic. When Harold Bride joked to Jack Phillips in the middle of Titanic's final hours to send SOS, "It may be your last chance," he was half serious, because SOS had only just been introduced as an alternative signal, and not every operator recognized it. The disaster settled the debate instantly. From 1912 onward, SOS was standardized as the sole international distress call known by every operator on every ship in every language. 3 simple dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, impossible to mistake, impossible to ignore, became the universal cry of danger. One might ask, how many lives after Titanic were saved because the world no longer wasted time decoding ambiguous signals? Titanic also revealed the fragility of onboard power. Her Marconi set was among the most powerful afloat. But as the ship took on water and her generators failed, her signals grew weaker and weaker until finally there was nothing left to send. Observers realized that a ship in extremis might lose the very ability to call for help before rescue could arrive. That insight led to another reform: the requirement that all large vessels carry emergency power reserves capable of keeping the wireless alive even if the main generators failed. In practice, this meant auxiliary batteries, backup dynamos, and redundant wiring designed to keep the voice of a ship alive, even when her hull was fatally compromised. But Titanic's legacy went far beyond individual rules. The disaster galvanized international cooperation in a way no previous maritime tragedy had. Within months, nations convened to draft the International Radio Telegraph Convention of 1912. For the first time, the world agreed on shared standards for frequencies, procedures, distress signals, and operator qualifications. No longer would ships be left to their own practices, using whatever codes or habits they pleased. Instead, maritime communication became a truly global system, with common rules binding together the navies and merchant fleets of dozens of countries. The Atlantic Ocean, once a place of isolated vessels, was transformed into a shared network, with the convention as its foundation. This was not a minor change in paperwork. It was the recognition that the sea was too vast and the risks too high for any nation to go it alone. The United States took its own decisive step with the Radio Act of 1912. Passed within months of the disaster, it mandated licensing for all radio operators, required certain ships to maintain powerful wireless equipment, and imposed penalties for failing to maintain constant watch. It also gave the federal government authority over the airwaves, laying the groundwork for later regulation of all broadcasting. In a sense, the modern world of radio, from commercial stations to regulated frequencies, traces its legal ancestry to the iceberg that ripped open Titanic. What began as an attempt to prevent one more ship from vanishing into silence ended up shaping the laws that govern all communication through the air. What is perhaps most striking is how Titanic's silence became its most powerful legacy. The final unanswered calls, the dead airwaves after 2:20 a.m., and the unanswered MGY signals etched into the logs of distant ships created a sense of horror that no inquiry could soften. Lawmakers did not have to be convinced by abstract arguments. They had the visceral record of messages sent into nothingness. How do you argue against the need for reform when you can read the exact words of Carpathia calling, "If you are there, we are firing rockets," and know that the only reply was silence? The Titanic tragedy, therefore, was not only about lifeboats and hull design, but about the way humanity learned to speak across the sea. Without these changes, countless later tragedies might have ended in equal silence. Instead, ships in peril after 1912 had a far greater chance of being heard, answered, and saved. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.